On December 5, 2022, a nuclear fusion reaction generated more energy than it took to start, or a net positive energy reaction for the first time in history. Once only theoretical, a massive scientific breakthrough was achieved that could be the building blocks to solve climate change and improve the world's energy system by orders of magnitude. Not to be confused with nuclear fission, which is a process of splitting atoms used in nuclear power plants currently. Nuclear fusion is a process of combining two atomic nuclei into one, releasing a massive amount of energy in the form of light and heat. Nuclear fusion is the same process that powers the sun and all other stars in the universe, and has the potential to be an incredibly clean and efficient source of energy fueled by the abundant element of hydrogen. However, there are still technical challenges to overcome before it can be harnessed as a practical energy source. Today, we'll discuss the road to achieving nuclear fusion, how it can be the solution to climate change, and discuss its potential path to commercialization at scale. So how did this breakthrough happen? Scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California achieved nuclear fusion with inertial confinement fusion by blasting 192 giant lasers at the laboratory's National Ignition Facility into a small cylinder about the size of a pencil eraser that contained a frozen pellet of hydrogen isotopes of deuterium and tritium encased in a diamond. The laser beams entering at the top and bottom of the cylinder vaporize and compress the fuel pellet, delivering the energy input needed to start the reaction. For context, deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen with an additional neutron, while tritium is a heavier isotope with 2 additional neutrons when compared to a typical hydrogen atom. In a brief moment lasting less than 100 trillionths of a second, 2.05 megajoules of energy, roughly the equivalent of a pound of TNT, bombarded the hydrogen pellet to trigger a fusion of a tritium and deuterium atom into one helium atom. As a result, neutron particles now separated from the fused hydrogen isotopes flowed out. As 2 light nuclei merged to form a single heavier nucleus, the process released energy as the total mass of the resulting single nucleus is less than the mass of the 2 original nuclei. The leftover mass as a result became energy. Einstein's equation equals mc squared, which says in part that mass and energy can be converted into each other, explains why this process occurs. As a result, this process carried about 3 megajoules of energy, a factor of 1.5 in energy gain, meaning this reaction crossed the ignition threshold, the dividing line where the energy generated by fusion equals the energy of the incoming lasers that start the reaction. Within nuclear fusion research, there are 2 main branches. Inertial confinement fusion, done by the NIF, where reactions begin by compressing and heating deuterium and tritium pellets filled with fuel, and magnetic confinement fusion, where reactions use magnetic fields to confine fusion fuel in the form of plasma to combine atoms. Inertial confinement fusion typically is a burst that lasts for a small fraction of a second, providing fusion conditions for a limited time, while magnetic confinement fusion creates the conditions of fusion continually with high temperatures, magnetic pressures, and the electric conductivity of plasma. Up until the NIF experiment, most nuclear fusion research and investment had been focused on magnetic confinement fusion, as many had doubts about inertial confinement due to its short bursts requiring near-perfect conditions and multiple blasts to yield energy. But now, the power once observed only in stars in the 1920s was now harnessed by humanity for the first time by the lesser researched method. When compared to current energy solutions, nuclear fusion has potential benefits to complement or replace the existing energy mix. Making up 76% of global energy consumption, split between coal, oil, and natural gas, energy is produced and consumed by burning hydrocarbons. However, obviously this is problematic for the environment, as adding oxygen to hydrocarbons creates the very carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, and pollutants that are causing global warming and deteriorating the air quality of the world. Of course, the fossil fuel industry has been searching for ways to mitigate emissions, including carbon credits, carbon storage, and biofuels. But at a global scale, it will be very difficult to reach net zero emissions and is largely not a renewable source of energy. While a stable fuel for energy storage, the reliance on fossil fuels has been slowly decreasing with the switch to renewables and other alternative sources of energy. 10% of energy consumption is now from renewable sources in solar, wind, and hydropower, with solar and wind growing from 0 to 4% and hydropower staying steady at 6% of the mix in the last decade. But while the energy sources are renewable and zero carbon, there are key challenges that will make its widespread adoption difficult as the final solution to the climate crisis. All three renewable sources play well in specific locations and conditions, but hydropower is specifically limited to locations with dams and reservoirs, making it impossible to serve all global energy capacity. Solar and wind, on the other hand, still has room to be developed in areas with sufficient weather conditions. That being said, the intermittency of weather conditions can create instability to renewable powered grids. Simply, for solar power, a cloudy day can stop the availability of energy, and even during the normal course of a sunny day, there is a mismatch between energy demand and supply, shown by this duck curve. Typically, energy demand drops in the morning after people have commuted to work, while it spikes again when they come back home around 5 or 6 p.m. But solar energy availability increases during the daytime when demand is weakest, and drops in the nighttime and early morning when demand is highest. Ultimately, the installation of renewables requires either utility-scale battery storage or a baseload energy source like fossil fuels to smooth out and back up energy supply throughout the day. Lastly, while solar and wind energy are renewable themselves, the materials used for the infrastructure to collect and store the energy can be limited and environmentally unsustainable, especially when it comes to materials like lithium and cobalt, which requires very energy-intensive and environmentally exhaustive processes in mining. In the most common extraction process, the production of lithium through evaporation ponds uses 2.2 million liters of water to produce 1 ton of lithium. The great requirement of water and byproducts will ultimately lead to significant air and water pollution, land degradation, and potential for groundwater contamination. Additionally, it's important when looking at long-term solutions to also see if renewable energy infrastructure in the form of solar panels and wind turbines can be recycled over time. Solar panels typically have a life of about 30 years. But once that time passes, MIT estimates that only 10% of solar panels are actually recycled. The same can be said for wind turbines, with most turbine blades going to the landfill after 20 to 25 years. As the first wave of renewable infrastructure is decommissioned, organizations will have the unique problem of coming up with processes to repurpose infrastructure materials to make solar and wind energy truly sustainable within the energy mix. Lastly, nuclear energy from the process of fission is also available in today's nuclear power plants, making up 4% of the energy mix. During nuclear fission, a neutron collides with an atom, typically uranium, and splits it, releasing a large amount of energy in the form of heat and radiation. The heat produced during nuclear fission in the reactor core is used to boil water into steam, which turns the blades of a steam turbine. As the turbine blades turn, they drive generators that make electricity. Nuclear plants then cool the steam back into water in a separate structure at the power plant called a cooling tower to be reused later to produce steam. While nuclear fission provides a zero-carbon reliable energy solution to stabilize grids, fission produces radioactive waste that is difficult to dispose of and harmful to humans. Despite nuclear power plants being 350 times safer than coal power plants per unit of energy produced, nuclear fusion has received a bad reputation due to various nuclear power plant meltdowns over the last couple of decades, including incidents at Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island in the US. While statistically safer, nuclear fission is haunted by past failures that bring cataclysmic front-page news compared to the more lethal but slower harm of fossil fuels. Overall, the current energy mix can complement each other, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to energy security and sustainability. But the promise of nuclear fusion brings the benefits of a safe, reliable, and clean energy source with an abundant source of hydrogen fuel and an unproblematic helium byproduct. While the current fusion discussion is still in its early stages of development in the lab, the real path to solving the climate crisis is commercializing it at scale. While nuclear fusion is not yet advanced to a state of commercial use, it will be important to see potential business models to see how nuclear energy and its benefits will be distributed among society once technically feasible. Ultimately, like solar and wind energy before, nuclear fusion will only be adopted at scale once the cost per unit of energy reaches parity with incumbent energy sources available. To make an educated guess on the business model of nuclear fusion, we can look at the utility space, which are essentially run as regulated monopolies. Utilities typically don't have competitors, but instead have a geographic monopoly with captive customers overseen by state public utility commissions to deliver electricity. This risks monopoly pricing, meaning that utilities can charge whatever they want. But to mitigate this, regulators control the electricity rate that utilities can charge with revenues based on the utility's rate base, or the total cost of the business assets used to generate and deliver electricity. As a result, utilities earn a profit by investing in capital expenses, such as new power plants, transmission, and distribution infrastructure, and recovering those costs through rates, plus an approved rate of return on investment. Operating expenses are treated as pass-through costs to consumers, so the utility companies are not incentivized to maximize or minimize business expenses like salaries or rent. In the long term, nuclear fusion plants will likely follow this model, following regulators in each geography, as the model maximizes the build-out of nuclear fusion infrastructure. So in a determination of how nuclear fusion can reach price parity, or for any energy source for that matter, the main metrics to look at are the capital expenditure to build the infrastructure to generate and distribute energy, the rate of return allowed on capital expenditures, the operating expenses needed to generate the energy, and the amount of energy that will be generated and consumed. If the capital expenditures and operating expenses can be spread over the production of many units of energy to a point where the rate is lower than incumbent rates, while the utility still reaches its maximum return on its capital expenditures, then an energy project will be adopted. At the onset, nuclear fusion will have prohibitively high capital expenditures, as the technology is not yet developed or improved to a level of efficiency that will be commercially feasible. Operating expenses will also be exceedingly high initially, as the expertise and skill sets of fusion operators are in short supply, likely limited to academics in the beginning. For context, it costs the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory $3.5 billion in capital expenditures to build the facility, and $350 million in yearly operating expenses for over a decade just to produce a net 0.95 megajoules of energy. For reference, 1 megajoule of energy is approximately 276 watt-hours, or enough to power a 60-watt light bulb for a little over 4.5 hours. Imagine paying $7 billion in electricity bills. Obviously, we have not reached commercial scale yet. But as the process of human-made nuclear fusion improves and more experiments iterate on best practices, the prices of infrastructure for capital expenditure and labor and materials should decrease by orders of magnitude over time to a point of widespread commercial adoption. Conceptually very ambitious at such an early stage of the technology, but also previously seen in the adoption of solar and wind energy. That being said, we're a channel that's interested in venture-backed startups, and utility companies do not seem to follow your typical startup model. There has to be another type of company that can create value through the development of technology rather than the capital expenditure for a power plant. As an alternative business model, organizations could discover novel processes or material inputs in nuclear fusion that can be claimed as intellectual property. If possible, the licensing of a proprietary nuclear fusion technology to utilities companies would be an asset-light approach to embed oneself in the global scale-up of energy production with a stream of income based solely on technology. But at such a premature stage in technology development, this is very hard to predict, as governments have clear interest to serve their people over private enterprises charging a toll on the availability of a world-changing innovation. Foreign governments in the past have stolen nuclear technology for other uses, so it would not be inconceivable that the processes could be stolen and replicated. Now back to the present. Before commercializing nuclear fusion, we first have to make it feasible. Below are some players within the nuclear fusion space split by fusion types between inertial confinement fusion and magnetic confinement fusion, working to make this possible on top of government-funded labs. Overall, magnetic confinement players have received the lion's share of investment despite difficulties in balancing electrical conductivity and magnetic pressures to contain the turbulent plasma fuel during fusion reactions. Of the handful of players, CFS, Tay Technologies, and Helion Energy have garnered significant investment at high valuations on the promise of a final energy solution, with some of the biggest players receiving backing from investors like Bill Gates and Tiger Global. With the success of the NIF, public and private investments is primed to explode for companies to enter the nuclear fusion space, especially within inertial confinement fusion. In 2023, the US government budgeted $1.4 billion in investments towards nuclear fusion, $763 million of which would go to the Fusion of Energy Sciences program within the Department of Energy, while another $630 million would be invested for research specifically on inertial confinement fusion. $380 million of which would fund the NIF. The government has funded research for decades, but private investment has now picked up over public investment, with $2.8 billion in fundings in 2022, following a record $4.4 billion investment year in 2021. The jury is out on who will make nuclear fusion feasible, but whoever can achieve nuclear fusion economically at scale will hold the keys to our energy future. To accelerate breakthroughs in nuclear fusion, academia, startups, private investment, and government participation will be needed. We may be a decade away from being decades away from commercializing nuclear fusion at scale, but once accomplished, we'll have explosive economic impacts with increased productivity from a higher energy capacity, especially in technological fields like artificial intelligence and quantum computing that require large amounts of power. Geopolitically, the power lines will also shift away from nations relying heavily on oil and gas as another energy revolution arrives. Ultimately, the achievement of energy production through nuclear fusion, even at a small scale, has made a future of a clean, stable energy grid globally a real possibility to move humanity forward.